Nehemiah in chapter 1. We've looked at this a little bit before. We talked about Ezra and Nehemiah. We finished out the book of Ezra. But then we go on into Nehemiah and seeing all the different individuals during this time that God had used. Not just one person, but many different ones God used in different ways to rebuild not just simply the walls, but we also see the rebuilding of hearts and lives, the recommitment of the children of Israel, the establishment of the temple. Many things has taken place in this time of refreshing, this time of rebuilding and restoration as well. So we'll look at this here in Nehemiah in chapter 1. Now, we already looked at the timing here. And again, hopefully you can see some of this, but I'll kind of share with you. But the return of Ezra is 458, and then the return of Nehemiah would be about 445 BC, not long after Ezra. But then we see what takes place in Nehemiah in chapter 1. We talked about before that Nehemiah, he goes from a royal cupbearer to a righteous leader. And we have several things to look at this evening just on his character, who he was. And then we notice in chapter 1 and verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hagaliah. It came to pass in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, I was in Shushan the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. And I asked him concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. They said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. And so it was, I heard these words, that I sat down. When I heard these words, I sat down and I wept. And I mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Here, one of the things we notice about Nehemiah is that he was empathetic for God's people. He was empathetic for God's people. Not just simply when we talk about sympathy where an individual may feel sorry for somebody, well, I have a little pity for you. But empathetic in that he felt himself in this as well, in this way, that this blight on the children of Israel, also a burden that he was bearing himself. And we'll see that in the prayers that he had offered up. But again, he was broken just like Ezra was broken over the corruption that was taking place within the children of Israel, and broken over the nation as well, dealing with purity. Now, Nehemiah had that concern too, but also he was so sorrowful over the state, the disrepair that the city was in, and that the people were doing very little about it as well. And so he was sad and mournful in this, and weeping unto the Lord. I think about the signs all throughout this city. It's very simple. It just says, love Dothan. My goodness. Y'all failed the pop quiz. So, love Dothan. That's it. Love Dothan, you know. And of course, I joke with the kids sometimes, if somebody forcing you, you better love Dothan. You better love it now. All right, love Dothan. But again, do we have a heart for this community? Now, many of you have lived here far. We've only been here 6 months. I can't consider myself a veteran or anything else. Even when I was in Texas, in Carthage, Texas, some of the ones that I would meet and visit with, they'd say, well, I'm still a rookie here. And I'd say, how long you been here? 45 years. And they still had people telling them, well, you ain't from around here. You ain't from around here. So, again, but this heart, this desire for his people, for the people of God, he had this empathy here. And I think about Hebrews, and you have the verse there, that Hebrews 13 in verse 3 says, remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them. Remember in the same way, even bearing that burden and having that empathy, like you are also in prison with them. And remember those who are mistreated, since you are also in the body. He's giving this sense of the believer should be seeking similar to what Paul talked about, that if you're members of one body, if one member hurts, then the other member should hurt. There should be this empathy within the body of Christ. And so Nehemiah was empathetic for God's people. He had this desire for them, for growth, and for them to be a testimony and a light to the nations. And so we notice as we go on, he says in verse 5, "And I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments, please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned." We understand here also the reality of the prayer that he has given. And we looked at that before. Again, he is not covering up their sins in this. He is saying, though, that we all have sinned. Now, another thing that we find interesting about Nehemiah is the position that he was in. He was trustworthy in his position. Who was he? He was a cupbearer. Well, that may not be a big deal to some people. But actually, a cupbearer in the royal court had a lot of influence and was to be a very trusted individual. The king would confide much into the cupbearer, but also the cupbearer's job was to make sure that the king would not be poisoned. And so he was around the king, and the cupbearer was supposed to always be pretty much happy. Okay? I would probably be executed. But always to be bubbly, always to be joyful, in this. And so his responsibilities were obviously to serve the king at meal times and different times, making sure that the drink was safe to drink. He was also, though, he could be a guard if need be, in a way. It's not something that if someone came into the royal court and he's there and something happens, somebody tries to go after the king, he also has an obligation and duty of protection. He was very much trusted in his position. And I look at, again, he could have held a lot of disdain in his heart for this king because of what happened to the children of Israel and where he was. He may have been captured and put in this position. We don't know. But again, we see it similarly with Joseph. When you look at the life of Joseph and you see how God used Joseph, even when Joseph was in prison, but even before then when he was in Potiphar's home, how God had favor on him and how he was a trusted individual. He was trustworthy in his position. And then even in prison, the prison guard ended up giving him authority and entrusting him. And so Nehemiah here, we see he was trustworthy in his position. He had that. He had somewhat of influence. And at times, cupbearers were known also to be advisors. This is also where you see Joseph actually relaying the dream that the one cupbearer had to Pharaoh. The dream that he had. Where he, again, but it was one of these things where if the king didn't like the cupbearer, if he felt like that something, even if he just went to bed and had a sick stomach and was well the next day, he could easily just call the cupbearer and have him killed and executed. So this is a difficult job in a way. And yet, the king, what we find is the king's attitude towards Nehemiah is one of trust. One that Nehemiah's character shows this here, that the king would confide in him, and the king actually sought for his well-being. The other thing that we also see and understand as well is that Nehemiah ultimately, we've looked at this before, is that he was steadfast in prayer. And we see that. We see that in these verses here. And as he prays unto God, seeking for God to work in his heart and life, he says in verse 8 of chapter 1, "Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name." He's praying for God to work. He's praying for God. In verse 11 he says, "May your servant," he's praying, "would you bring prosperity." Verse 11 he says, "O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." Who's he talking about? He's praying for mercy in the sight of the king. And he says, for I was the king's cupbearer. Now we go on into chapter 2. And we notice another aspect when it comes to him. Now, 1 Thessalonians in 5 and verse 7 is a very short verse, but it says simply, pray without ceasing. Pray without ceasing. The first time I read that, when I was young, I thought, my word, that is impossible to do. An impossibility. Always pray without ceasing. Never stop. That's it. Don't even eat. Just keep praying. But then later, I began to think that I had the Greek wording under control. I read one book. I mentioned this before. I preached a message when I was 15 years old. I'd read a Pentecostal prayer book, and it used this Greek wording, and the ceasing was this idea of fervency. And so I said, oh, well, it's nothing to do with continually praying. You just got to pray hard. You got to pray really hard. And so, that for me was at the time, I remembered somebody bringing that up when they talked about praying. And saying, well, the Bible says pray without ceasing. And me at 15 years old, I'm reclining back and putting my arms behind my head and saying, well, that's the Greek word for this. And I didn't know what I was talking about, but it sounded good in the book that I was reading. And I said, it means just fervency, and you just got to be fervent, and that's all it means. Well, no, this sense of the wording that Paul uses, pray without ceasing, we see it in the life of Nehemiah. We see that. It is like breathing. That's the reality of it. Your life should be in a spirit of prayer continually. That no matter where you are, it's not that you just pray all the time forever, but no matter where you are, what time, whatever it is, you can pray. And you have no qualms about that. And you're living your life in this way that you're just ultimately focused on the Lord. And it doesn't matter where it is, what time, what it is, you pray. That is this lifestyle of prayer that's continually, it's almost like breathing in your life. And it comes natural. Now it doesn't. The reality is prayer doesn't come natural in our flesh. But we look at the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. But still here, Nehemiah is a man of prayer. And he lived this life of prayer without ceasing. He's steadfast in prayer. Notice in chapter 2, in verse 1, it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. This is why the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. He sees that he's downtrodden. Nehemiah cannot contain this. He cannot fake this in any way of the heartache and the brokenness that he experiences, the empathy within his life. And the king says, I see there is sorrow in your heart. And he says, why are you sad? Now, notice, he says, I became dreadfully afraid. Okay? Oh man, Nehemiah, what a chicken. Really? He's right there. King, you got to be happy all the time. If you make the king sad, you're in trouble. But he's afraid in this. And yet we see, it says, and the king said, he said to the king, he's afraid because he doesn't know how the king is really going to respond to this. But he knows he has to lay this out there to the king. And he has prayed over it. He has prayed over it. He says, may the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad? When the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. And the king said, what do you request? Very simple question. And notice here in verse 4, so I prayed to the God of heaven. Do you think he stood there for an hour, not answering the king? And just stood there and just was, oh, Lord, please. No, he didn't. This was probably one of the shortest prayers he ever prayed in his life. But guess what he did? Right there, before the king, when the king asked him a question, he did not hesitate to quickly say a word of prayer to God before he answered. He knows what God has put in his heart. But do you see here this pray without ceasing, no matter where you are? even if you're in front of a king, even if it seems like, well, this is not the right time, it's not kosher. It's just, really? You can pray anywhere, anytime. I love when I was in South Carolina, the Earl Hannon, pastor that I worked with there. He had a sign on his door, in the office door. It said, "In session with the king." In session with the king. What a wonderful sign there. In session with the king. So Nehemiah had those sessions. And even now, when he is asked a quick question by the king, he offers up a very quick prayer to God. And then he says to the king in verse 5, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." And then the king said to me, the queen was also sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" Okay? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Now, this is another thing we understand about Nehemiah. Nehemiah was wise in preparation. He was wise in preparation. He had already prepared prior, and already knowing that God had placed in his heart, not just simply to say, "Lord, I pray you help Israel. I pray you help the people there. Send somebody." He says, "God, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this being cupbearer, but Lord, if you want me to, I'm willing to go. I'm willing to be used by you. Here am I, God." And he says, "Lord, give me that opportunity." And he says, "I'll be your laborer. I'll be your laborer." So he's wise in preparation. Proverbs in chapter 16 in verse 6 or in verse 3 says, Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established." Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. One of the things we see about dealing with preparation, one, we see there's this royal permission and divine guidance. Royal permission and divine guidance. He is seeking. He knows that. Now, he could have packed his bags. He could have fled because he thought, well, if I'm sad and if I make my plans known to the king, he could kill me. So Nehemiah could have tried to drum up support in the background and then packed his bags and just took off. That's a terrible idea, but he could have done it. And some people look at that. They look at an easy way out, an easy way to go. And no, he doesn't do that, though. He knows he's seeking for this permission. Here's the wonderful thing about it, is that getting that permission, he's also given supplies. He's also given far more than he could have ever done just himself going to help Israel. But ultimately, it is not just simply seeking that permission. It is also, before then, seeking that divine guidance. For God to guide and to prosper his way in this work. And so he gives the king. What we find is also he gives the king the actual timeline. The king says, well, how long? What does this look like? And he could have easily said, well, I don't have a clue. I just going to ask you and see what you said. You know? I mean, I hate to say it. When I went to college, I tried my best to prepare for the papers that were given. I hated writing papers. First time I ever wrote a paper was in college. I'm going to tell you that. You know, long story short, my dad left when I was 11. My mother couldn't afford to put us in Christian school. The public school that was around us was terrible, and thankfully she didn't do that. But she could not. She had to work and stuff. So she gave us assignments to do. But guess what? A lot of our schooling was PBS and recreational, outside hitting the ball in Doc's yard. So anyway, but you know, I didn't have a lot of experience with the paperwork. But you know, and of course I had to go into basic English and everything else. But I remember, you know, they give these assignments and having to write and exams and everything else, and I would not wait to the last minute. I tried to study and research. But my mind, I promise you, my brain does not. I don't know if anybody else is like this. But my brain says, it's okay. You have time. I will not think right now of this. And it's like, please think of this. I need help. And it wouldn't happen. And the very night of the paper, then all of a sudden it comes, That's what I had 3 papers due with Greek. I got a 96 on the exam. I had 3 papers due. I did every single paper that night. With every paper, it got worse. The teacher told me, he said, the only reason why you got the 96 is your first paper was really good. He said, I don't know what you put on that 3rd paper. I said, I don't know either. I have no clue. But going there to college, for me, I had a lot of desire and passion for things that, we've got to do this. We've got to, boy, there's people dying going to hell, and we got to get this situated. We got to go. And I had to learn. The reality is that you can go with a passionate heart, and you ought to have passion, but guess what? That doesn't exclude preparation. And I would write down to remind myself, prepare with passion. Prepare with passion. You've got to have preparation. You can't just run gung-ho. And so he is wise in his preparation. And in preparing for it, he knew when he wanted to go. He understood what needed to be done. And we see this here with the life of Nehemiah. The life of Nehemiah. We notice we go on. He says, the king granted me, according in verse 8. He says, let's notice in verse 7. Furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates, for the citadel. He's already got all this in his mind. This is why he was afraid, but he still told the king and he's prayed to God. Because he understood what needed to be done. He laid this out. Jesus said, count the cost. Count the cost. This preparation. But notice, he said, as we go on, he says, and a letter be given for the timber to make given me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me, according to the good hand of my God upon me. Again, he knows that it's God's favor, God's hand leading and guiding. He sees this. He says, then I went to the governors in verse 9 in the region beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. The thing about it, he knows, Nehemiah knows that when he does his work, there are going to be some that hate Israel, but also some that don't want to see the work flourish. Already there has been ones laying the foundation of the temple. Already Ezra has been a nuisance and getting people together. You think the devil's going to sit back and do nothing? So he's going to use different ones to try to stop the work. And one of those individuals was Sanballat. Another one was Tobiah. So we notice as we go on. In verse 12 it says, then I arose in the night, I and a few, they came to Jerusalem. They came to Jerusalem and they were there for 3 days. So what we notice as well is not only royal permission and divine guidance, but then sacred reflection and secret inspection. Why are they there 3 days? Again, I believe fully that he's there taking his time, observing and praying. He is not rushing into this. He is assessing and he's praying, and there is this sacred reflection that's taken place. But then we also see this secret inspection that ends up happening. Notice in verse 12. I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Nor was there any animal with me except the one which I rode. What does that even matter? Well, he didn't want to cause any kind of disturbance. He didn't want anybody really to know that he was even there. Why? What's the big deal? He should have sounded a trumpet. Hey, we're doing this. Come on, everybody. No. He's meticulous. And he doesn't want. He wants this work to be done. He wants it to be done well. But he knows that time is of the essence in a way, but not in the sense that we got to hurry up and immediately do it. But again, if they quickly, and everyone knows and it spreads throughout the land, people are going to come around and try to stop the work. And so he wants to go ahead and get situated, assess the damages, see what needs to be done, make preparations before anybody knows about it, before even the people that he wants to work on the wall know about it. He's already assessing it. He's already gone before and looking. And he doesn't want rumors to spread. He says, I went out by night through the valley gate, to the serpent well and the refuge gate. And we'll look at these later on and view the walls of Jerusalem which were broken down, and its gates which were burned with fire. I went on to the fountain gate, to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went up in the night by the alley and viewed the wall, and then I turned back and entered the valley gate, and so returned. Again, I would have to say, I don't have this great of gifting of preparation with. See, Nehemiah probably loves reading instructions. Anybody else love to read instructions? I hate reading instructions. But then I go back and I'm like, why did I not read the instructions? Why don't I do this? Nehemiah is preparing. He is getting things laid out and situated, and he's understanding this, and he's seeing it for himself and assessing. He's wise in his preparation. He says, notice as we go on, in verse 16, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. The other thing we see as well is inward commitment and outward encouragement. We see his commitment to the work inwardly, but then we see also, what does he do? He doesn't tell once then, but now when the time is right, he says, then I said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. He has everything situated. He knows how it needs to be laid out. He's got it mapped out. And so he's now giving and casting that vision to the people, encouraging them. He says, I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. And then they set their hands to this good work. He encourages them, but not until he then knows how it needs to go about. And he gives that vision to them. And he says, listen, God is with us. And I've seen God work in this. Look at verse 19 and we'll be finished. The last thing we see, he was bold in the midst of persecution. Proverbs 28:1 says, the wicked flee when no man pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. The righteous are bold as a lion. In verse 19, but when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? They don't realize that God is with them. He said, so I answered them, oh, please leave us alone. No, he didn't do that. He says, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. Nehemiah, stop. You're going to make somebody mad. You're going to offend somebody. Again, Nehemiah is bold. And he knows the work that needs to be done. And Nehemiah knew. He knew that there were going to be people that wanted that work to stop. He knew that. He wasn't surprised about it in the slightest. And yet he was wise in his preparation. He was wise in that. And he was bold, even in the midst of persecution. Well, let's pray this evening.